Although biologists often develop classification schemes which group organisms into species and subspecies and varieties, as Charles Darwin noted, this can be both messy and a bit arbitrary. Where does a subspecies end and a species begin? Take this example where one ancestral species spreads over a wide geographic range, but after climate fluctuation changes the habitat, then this larger population is then split into five subpopulations, which then change over time relative to one another. If population 1 and population 2 individuals sometimes encounter each other in the wild at the perimeters of their ranges where they overlap, and they can interbreed, would one consider them the same species? Many might say yes, they would be varieties or subspecies of the same species. If population 1 and 5 could do the same, would one consider them the same species? Many would argue yes. If our definition of species is the set of populations which can interbreed in the wild under natural conditions, how would we look at population 2 and 5 which do not encounter each other in the wild? Would it matter if they can interbreed in captivity? Let's continue this example and imagine that population 1 and 3 can sometimes encounter each other where their ranges overlap, and they can interbreed and produce offspring. However, the offspring are infertile. Do we classify them as the same species? If the same situation applied to populations 1 and 4, where they could interbreed, but the young were never born alive. They never hatched from eggs. They failed during development. What would that mean? If populations 3 and 4 never encounter each other and have never interbred in captivity, how would we classify them? The last example introduced the variable that even if populations can interbreed, what does that mean? Does it mean that their offspring are just as healthy as would populations that bred among themselves? What happens if they're a little less healthy? What would happen if they're much less healthy? What would happen if they're infertile some of the time, or miscarriages are more common? What would happen if they're infertile most of the time, the hybrid offspring? And so being able to interbreed and produce offspring or fertile offspring, this isn't necessarily an all or none scenario. There can be varying degrees of this. What degrees do we accept in the definition of the same species? Finally, if our definition involves which populations can interbreed under natural conditions, what happens when humans change the natural conditions? For example, if each of these populations can interbreed to varying degrees with population 1, one might consider them to be, a set of populations within a single species. But if then humans alter the habitat and cause population 1 to become extinct, then how many species are there? How do we consider the individuals that humans can interbreed together in captivity? If humans moved individuals from one population into another area as an invasive species, and it could interbreed with the local species there, how might that change? So in sum, it is often difficult to apply the term species in the wild and to clearly classify groups. There are often gray areas and species complexes which are difficult to classify.